I'm sure you have noticed how some words sound almost identical across the languages. Take the English word day. Its equivalent in Spanish sounds very similar, dia. In Russian we have день. They sound so similar that you might assume they all come from the same origin. But this story turns out to be more complicated. Welcome to this series on the origins of English words and their relatives in Russian and Spanish. This video is entirely in English, but if you're learning Russian and you want to have some Russian listening comprehension practice, I have a bilingual version of this video and it will be available in the description below. The Russian word день, the English word day, and the Spanish dia sound so similar, and to be honest, for a long time I was convinced that they were related. It just seems so obvious. However, when I start digging into the history of these words, I found out something I definitely did not expect. Let's go back once again to the proto indo-european language. There was a root that meant daylight. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but it went something like diu. This root existed in Latin, and that's why we find it in the modern Romance languages. Like in Spanish, there's the word dia. In Italian, there's giorno. In French, there's jour. That's because the sound d also shifted to the sound j or j in some of those languages. And some of these words eventually made their way into English. That's why we have, for example, the word diary. In the Slavic languages, this same root, dyu, produced the word день, day. So yes, we can see that the Spanish dia and the Russian день are actually related. However, in the case of English, this story has a sudden twist. The English word day sounds incredibly close to the Spanish word dia. However, turns out it comes from a different Proto-Indo-European root. If you happen to know some German, you might remember that the word day in German is Tag. Both the German Tag and the English day come from their Proto-Germanic ancestor. And there was a root dagas, and dagas meant day. That dagas came from an earlier source, the Proto-Indo-European language, where there existed the root dhegh. Let's assume it's pronounced teg, I'm not sure, obviously. And that root was associated with burning. And that's very curious because in Russian we have a very similar verb, and that's the verb to burn, жечь or сжигать. So that's how we got three similar looking words, the English day, the Russian день, the Spanish dia, that actually turned out not to be cognates. Cognates are the words that are related. That is because they come from two different roots, the Spanish day and the Russian день from the root daylight, and the English day comes from the root to burn. And so the history of the word day gives us a glimpse of how the words evolve. Ancient roots spread across languages, change their sounds, and often even change their meaning. If we look at the word sky, we can see this process very clearly. The word sky has a completely different story. Here again, we see something familiar. Russian and Spanish here turn out to be much closer than you would expect. In Russian, we have the word небо, sky. And in Spanish, there is the word nube, a cloud. And these two words are related. They both come from the same Proto-Indo-European root, neb, which meant cloud or mist. And that root existed in Germanic languages as well. Even in Old English, we still find the word nivel or nivel, which meant misty or dark, gloomy. But over time, it disappeared from the language. Modern English has the root neb, but of Latin origin. For example, the word nebula. And if you're wondering where the word sky comes from, it's not originally English either. It came from Old Norse, but it also has a Proto-Indo-European origin. It's associated with the ancient root skew, which transmitted the idea of covering. probably because the sky covers the earth. Another explanation is that the sky in the Scandinavian countries is often overcast, and therefore it comes from the root to cover. And since we're talking about that root to cover, SKEW, let's see in which words we can find it in the Romance and the Slavic languages. If we look at Spanish, we find it in some words connected with the idea of covering. For instance, there is the word escudo, the shield. This root is also hidden in the word obscuro. In English it would be obscure, because that's the idea, something screened from the light. And the same goes for Russian. We find it in the word shkura, which means animal skin, probably because skins served for clothing. So the English word sky has distant relatives in Spanish and Russian, even though they have absolutely different meanings and sound quite different as well. I personally find it quite amazing. But the most fascinating story is, in my opinion, is that of the word moon. Let's compare the Russian word luna, the Spanish word luna, and the English word moon. Are they related? What do you think? And the first surprise is, the Russian word luna is not actually Russian. It's borrowed from Latin. In the past, in Russia, people used a different word, the word месяц, which in the modern language is mostly used to say month. So in the past, this word месяц used to mean two things at once, the moon and the month. And the reason is simple. For the most of human history, people used the lunar calendar. So it was pretty common to associate that period of time, the 4 weeks, with the moon. And we can notice it even in English. Look at the word moon and month. The reason they look similar is that they both come from the same root. They come from the proto indo-european root me, which meant precisely these two things, and besides that, it was associated with measuring. So actually the word to measure comes from the same root, because people used to measure time according to the phases of the moon. And you can find the same root me in the Russian words like месяц, month, мерить, to measure, and you can find it in Romance languages. For instance, in Spanish there is mes, month, and medir, to measure. And so we finally find here three clear cognates in all the three languages: month, месяц, mes. But what about the word luna or luna in Spanish? What relatives does it have in Russian and English? As I mentioned before, the word luna came into Russian from Latin, just like the English adjective lunar. But the root itself goes back much further, to the proto-indo-european root leuk, associated with light. In Spanish we find quite a bunch of words with this root. There is luz, light, lucir, emit light, alumbrar, illuminate. By the way, the word illuminate has the same root. And if we look into truly English words, not the ones borrowed from Latin, there's the word light itself. And by the way, that original root leuk explains why in English you still spell the word light with GH. It's basically a distant memory of that k sound in the original root, in the ancestral root. And in Russian it appears in the word luch, which means a ray of any kind of light. And that's how everyday words like day, moon, and sky can travel across many languages and thousands of years. And once you start following these old roots, you start noticing those connections between the languages that seem so distant and different at first. If you enjoy this kind of linguistic detective story, let me know in the comments which word we should trace next. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're very welcome to subscribe to this channel. And I'll see you in the next episode.